Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me I have Woody Zuill. He's come back for part two of our mob programming series. Hello, Woody.
Hey there, how you doing today?
I'm great. So last time we talked about the history of mob programming, where it came from, the things involved in mob programming as far as what it takes for a team to be able to do it, and the benefits of pairing and mobbing and strong style pairing. So that's kind of a wrap up of the last episode. So Woody, my first question for you is, what are some good openings of conversation to introduce the topic of mob programming?
Oh, that's a kind of a cool thing to think about. Years ago, when I wanted to interest people in pair programming, I had found an article someone had written about it, and it could have been one of the primary players in it. And I printed it out. It was just a couple pages. And whenever I'd come to somebody that I thought might be open to talking about these things, I would just hand them the article and say, hey, I read this thing about this way of coding, and I was wondering what you thought about it. So rather than saying, hey, here's something, let's do this, I just was, and I poked around with that kind of an approach for quite a while. And then I stumbled on this thing. Somebody kind of shared with me a nice way to bring these things up. And one was to simply ask for help whenever I was going to work on something. And so that's what makes it easy with pair programming. But so how does it go to mob programming all of a sudden? Because that's a much bigger leap. Just based by saying to somebody, hey, I need a little help here. Can all six of you come and help me? Probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But one way to talk about it, I think, is to introduce the idea of what are the problems that we are coming upon that slow us down or block our productivity.
Okay.
And I don't like to approach things from a problems point of view much of the time. But that's been kind of an interesting one when people really start delving into why or how it is they're getting slowed down. A lot of that stuff relates back to that we separate each other when we're working. Yeah,
sure.
So that's another thing. But there's some other great things you can do. So if somebody actually came to me and said, hey, I want to introduce this at my place of work, but I'm not having a lot of success getting people interested, then I suggest that we do a simple, fun exercise, like a game. Like, hey, we saw this thing on YouTube, and I want to just try it. We can just do it for like during lunchtime or whatever. So I don't know if that's real helpful, but there's a guy out of Copenhagen that does that all the time. He consults with teams, and as he goes out, he just says, hey, let's do this fun exercise for a while, without telling them what it is exactly. And, just dig into it. Now, again, that may not be answering your question, so I'll leave that to you to clarify.
No, that's good. I mean, one of the things that I do is, I think I talked about it last episode where I run these little workshops, but also when it comes to the real world problems, we'll pick a story and I'll say, hey, let's pick a story that we can work on together as a team, right? And depending on the team, maybe I won't call it mob programming, or sometimes I do. Some people, when they hear that word, they get a little bit scared. They don't know what that means, or So so what I'll do is we'll pick the story and we'll pick the task, let's say, and we'll go in a room, and then I'll kind of facilitate it using mob programming rules, and they just kind of see what it's like, and then they realize, oh, this is what mob programming actually is. So that's one way I tend to do it.
Yeah, I like that. Nancy Van Schwinterwert, who helps put on the mob programming conference, when she first heard about mob programming, she kind of she could see that there was a potential there, and she would just show the 3-minute video that we had made back in 2012 that showed our team working for an entire day. That's just 3 minutes, and says, hey, look at these crazy guys here at this thing, and look at what they're doing. And then there's that one little rule from Llewellyn in there where it says, for an idea to go from somebody's head into the computer, it has to go through someone else's hands.
Right.
And then she would suggest, let's just use that rule and see what happens. And so, that introduces the idea that we've got to start learning to communicate.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I would say one of the things that we don't practice and we don't spend a lot of time figuring out how to do is to communicate our ideas about coding and what it is we think we want to try next. So I think it's a great little approach. That's like a 5-minute introduction, 3 minutes of video, and a couple minutes of talking about it.
Right.
And,
yeah, that's a great way to get
you can
started.
actually start it. Yeah. Well, it's a funny thing that I've seen now maybe a couple dozen times when I've come into a company or doing a public workshop even, and somebody says, "Oh yeah, we've done this," and tell me about it,
Right.
And they'll say, "Yeah, like we had a big emergency and we got everybody together, and within an hour and a half or 2 hours, we had everything worked out." And I said, "Well, how'd that go?" Boy, it was great. We learned a lot.
Right.
We got to the root of the problem quickly, and so on. And then my next question is, well, why didn't you keep doing it? Because it was like you do it and then you go back to your old way of working.
Right.
So it's not so puzzling to me because it just doesn't seem like that's an all day, every day kind of thing. It doesn't have to be, of course. And yet enough people have shared that story with me where they gathered everyone together so they could get through some big problem. That it kind of makes me think that it was bubbling under the surface long before, we kind of identified it as an actual way of working on a regular basis.
Right.
So that's why I say I don't think we invented it. I think we discovered it.
Sure. Okay. So I'll give you an example of that when you talk about teams who try it and then they think it's really good, and then for some reason they just stop doing it. And how, so there was a team I was working with who, they were doing it almost every day and they were loving it. And then I came back, I think I was out for a couple of weeks and I was working with some other teams. I came back and I said, "How's it going?" And the Scrum Master said, "That team really isn't doing it anymore." Right. And I said, "Well, what, there's no value in it? Why?" And she said, "No, there's value in it, but, they just seem to be not willing to do it." And my suggestion was maybe we just need to encourage a little bit because changing the way you work is not something that happens overnight. We tend to fall back on old habits. We tend to get back into our old patterns. It's like anything. It's like anything you're trying to make a change in your mindset and how in your disciplines and the way you practice, it takes repetition, right? So that's
right.
Something, So even if you stop doing it for a few days, even if you stop doing it for a while, it's okay. You can try it again and realize that, hey, when we do it, we actually enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, right?
So let's kind of dig a little deeper in there. So the first thing I would be wondering is, we tried it on some real work. But did we try practicing it as well?
Okay.
It's like if you were, so I can go back to when I was a kid, and my older brothers had what they used to call a garage band. 3 or 4 guys that get together with some, somebody's got some drums and a bass guitar and a guitar and a singer and some equipment, and you set it up in your garage, and you just play the standard tunes that everybody likes. Well, sure, you can do that and just, kind of improvise, and that's kind of fun. But if you want to go play a gig, play some music for other people, you're going to want to practice it for a while. And you don't practice in front of your live audience because you're going to go over things over and over again.
Right.
So, and so then we have to ask the question, well, why would we do that? And, it's clear, hopefully, that we do that because we're going to get a lot better by practicing, not just playing.
Yeah. And
I have a really clear memory of that when I was, I don't know, in my late teens. And I happened to be playing with a little band where there was one guy who was just extremely good, really outclassed everybody else in the band. And there was one younger guy who really was getting ready to get good, but he was always stretching himself too much. He would try to do stuff he couldn't yet do. And this slightly more seasoned guy goes, you know what? If you just take that thing you're trying to do there, that little lick, go off in the corner and practice it 10 times, then come back over, you're going to have it.
Right.
And I took that to heart, because this is about practicing so that you can be better together. So mob programming means we have to practice some things on our own, and we have to practice some things as a team. And then we can also do the real work of it.
Right.
The pressure of the work itself often distracts us from the learnings we need to be doing to get better at it.
That's a great point. Great point. Awesome. I'm gonna use that one because that's a good example.
Well, I wish I had invented that, but I think that goes back to the beginning of time.
Right.
I'm pretty sure there was some kind of really early caveman who was getting pretty good at slinging rocks around,
right.
And he'd go up to the other guys and say, "Look, you got to practice it before that buffalo is charging at you."
No, it's a good reminder because a lot of times teams say we want to practice on real work. We don't want to do these examples, and that's actually a feedback I get a lot because I tend to just start off with practicing with examples and not real work. And the purpose of that is so they can learn. And so I get it. Like you and I are on the same page, but it's a good reminder for me to go back to that sometimes because and not just give in to the wanting to do real work right away.
But there's that famous John Wooden, who was a famous basketball coach.
Yep.
And I remember, and if one of your listeners remembers where the story comes from, some well-known basketball player who had been coached by Wooden said, when I started working with him, he taught me how to dribble, but without the ball.
Okay.
So to me, that's a really telling thing. He said what he wanted me to do was to pay attention to my feet. And I couldn't pay attention to my feet when I was actually working with the ball. So I like that idea. It's like, sure, you could, if you want to learn to dribble basketball, and I'm not a basketball player, but you in high school you play on the, during PE or whatever. If you want to get good at it, there's other things to consider besides the ball and how you're handling it, right, and how you're bouncing it. Where are your feet? How are you leaning? What's your balance? How good are you at balancing? Can you change directions? Where do you put your feet to do that? I would say that this is what we're talking about.
Okay.
When I was first working with the team, when we were learning to do this, we accidentally learned how to listen to each other because we were doing coding dojo that only allowed you to speak. We had this rule. It's one of the coding dojo mechanisms I like to use. You're only allowed to speak if you're the navigator. And you're rotating the pairs every few minutes, so the navigator becomes the driver, and the next observer becomes the navigator. So the observers, you're going to observe for 4 or 5 turns, depending on how many people there are. So you don't get to talk because there's no talking allowed by the observers for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. That's really tough for most programmers. And so we're actually learning to hear what the other person's saying, let them finish their sentence, allow them to finish their thought. Because a lot of times when people are sharing a thought, they're going to have little gaps between their sentences. And we're always ready to jump in, and say, well, wait a second, or whatever. This was letting us learn, hey, yeah, we can handle letting someone finish out their idea. Oh, another little cool rule, if you don't mind me sharing it, is
sure.
That we used in our coding dojo leading up to learning mob programming was that you weren't allowed to come in when it was your turn to navigate and say, I don't like what we're doing, delete everything, we're going to start over.
Right.
The rule is once we have a test, or at least one test passing, because you always write one test, and get it to pass. Mm-hmm. Once you have a passing test, you're not allowed to do anything but refactor to the new way you want to do it.
Right.
And that was teaching us to be patient with the ideas. We listen more carefully to what the person who's going before us is talking about and thinking about, and they're putting it on the whiteboard so we can carry on with their idea instead of telling them why we got to try something else.
Okay. So I have a question, Woody. Do you ever get into, when you're coaching teams for mob programming, do you ever get into like level 2 listening. So,
tell me about that.
As a coaching technique, so you have level 1 listening, which is the way we normally listen, which is when someone's talking, we're kind of thinking about our own thoughts, like we're listening to them,
right?
But things are coming in our head and we're getting ideas, and then we have a back and forth. That's just a regular conversation, right? And so the level 2 listening is when someone's talking, we have 100% focus on whatever that person's saying, and then if something comes in our head, we kick it out immediately. So, and it's actually...
Well, that's all I ever do.
So it's basically just training your focus to only listen and not respond. And it's basically, I was wondering if that's something you ever do with teams, because most people don't think about that when they're listening, because as a coach, that's something that I'm working on too. It's not to give my own ideas. I mean, sometimes I can give my ideas for sure, but generally I'm trying to listen more and really hear what the person's saying before I give any input or anything, So that's just training your brain to kind of, the way you listen, to try to refocus it. And both are needed. You need to have conversations, but I do think that training your brain to listen is something that's really valuable. So I was just wondering if that's something you had even talked to team members about, was how to listen.
Yeah, actually, I had learned just a little bit ago of a few exercises to do for that.
Okay.
And I've started using them. And so for myself as well as for others, because, this mob programming coding dojo style almost forced us to do that kind of listening rather than thinking about how we're going to react. Matter of fact, I learned something from another speaker at a conference about what she did when she would come up with an idea that she wanted to say. She would just jot a note about it and let it rest. And that was how she took it out of her mind. I think there's some studies that show that if you do that, then you can go on. Otherwise, you want to keep thinking about the thing that came into your mind. And that forces you to not listen, because we really can't do both at the same time. Right. So, yeah, I really like it. The exercise, basically, I learned from Michael Sahota. I don't know if you know of him, but he's a well-known agilist, and I like the guy a lot. He's just full of great stuff. But basically, you do an exercise just like you kind of shared. You're going to listen to someone else talking about something that's interesting, or they're going to at least try to talk about something that's interesting. And whenever you feel like you want to talk, you put that out of your mind. And whenever you feel like you want to think about what you might say, you put that out of your mind. Exactly what you described. I didn't know it was called level 2.
Yeah.
But now I do. So now I got a handle to put on it. So that's really cool.
So that's something that they talk about in coaching, and this level 2 listening.
Yeah, the coactive coaching and stuff.
So, okay, cool. So that's good to know. So any kind of, since you started it in 2011, anything you've learned since then, tips that you might want to share, anything like that?
Well, the first thing that we noticed was that there was a very active learning environment. Mm-hmm. And then, but along the way, we also noticed that because there was so much learning going on, people were they wanted to dig into things when it might have distracted us from the work we were trying to do. I don't know if I shared this last, because I've shared this story quite a bit last episode, but for example, if somebody says, you know what, I think I'd like to use a delegate here, or something like that. And then someone else says, I've never used a delegate. What's that? Well, we recognize that that's not something we really need to do.
Okay.
Because if we just try using a delegate, everybody's going to learn about it anyways. And so we would put that in a parking lot. So whenever somebody would ask a question like that, we put it in the parking lot. And then in an hour or so, if you still didn't understand it, then we might cover it. But what we started doing with them is just taking it the very next morning. First thing in the morning, we did an hour-long study session. And we'd pick it up in that study session and explain whatever it was. Usually, by the next day, everybody understood because we'd been working on it all day. So that's one of the things that we learned. How to keep it flow. This is all about flow. I think last episode we talked about flow.
We did. But I don't think you told that story. And
Okay.
I think that story is great because it makes a lot of sense. So that's something that I think I'm going to start practicing is that the parking lot part of it, and then revisit it in the morning. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it kind of gives you maybe a backlog of things we want to
Right.
learn. I will share another one if
Sure.
you want. So one of the things about ideas is we'll get conflicting ideas, and we really need to be careful not to get conflicts of personality going on. So we need to really separate that we have two different ideas from two different people who think everything's got to be the way they want it to be. So if we can separate this into a mechanism, and the mechanism I like to suggest is let's try both ideas.
Okay.
An amazing thing happens when we have two ideas about how to do something, and people have a strong opinion about which one they want to try. So traditionally, I have seen programmers discuss which of two ideas they want to try for longer than it would take to try both ideas.
Right.
And at the end of it, you still haven't tried one or the other ideas till you've decided on which one, and then we're going to still get to the point where somebody's going to say, "Yeah, let's try the other one." So why not just set out to try both of them? Because a bizarre thing happens when we try two ideas, and that is a third and a fourth idea will pop up. Now, I've heard people say, well, then we'll never get anything done. But software development is one of these things where, like I say over and over, it's in the doing of the work that we discover the work that we must do, because the doing exposes reality. I'm sure I said that last week because I say that all the time. So if we don't try the things, discussing them isn't going to give us any new knowledge. If we're really sophisticated in having a discussion and somebody's really open to changing their mind, they might go, "Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Let's do your way. Mine's not going to work."
Right.
But dang, we can prove that to ourselves just by putting it into code.
Yeah.
Now, there's lots of other things, so we could probably stay on this for a long time. We've literally been mob programming for over 6 or coming on 7 years.
Sure.
Real soon. We've seen a lot of stuff, and there's just so many avenues we can go down.
Okay. Well, I know you've been doing a lot of workshops, Woody, recently, and maybe before we even move on, you can give a little plug about what you can offer for one of your workshops if someone wants to bring you in. And I know you have 1 and 2 and 3 day workshops you do.
Yeah. Well, so the key to mob programming, I think, for someone who's just getting introduced to it, is that you can't learn the things you need to learn in a 1 or 2 day or even 3 day workshop. It's about building habits and building techniques for interacting well with each other. And this is something that just takes time, a lot of time. So what you can learn in a workshop is what are those things we need to be paying attention to that we're going to learn over time. I've had a lot of people now when I've done the workshops where it's become clear to me that the primary thing is, can we stay quiet long enough? And so that's one of the things that I try to pay attention to. All the things that we cover are basically, what is this about? Why might we want to do it? And how are we going to go about doing it? So that means something about, well, what it is pretty straightforward, but even still, there's lots of avenues there. It doesn't necessarily have to be, 8 hours every day with the whole team. There are some teams that work very dynamically. So maybe they join together as a mob for an hour, split up into pairs for an hour, come back together, share what they've developed, and go on, and so on. So there's lots to this. It's hard to cover in just a few, in just the bare idea. I want us to see in the workshop, where are the bottlenecks and how do we learn to start sharing with each other?
Right.
So those are some of the exercises that we do. I have one exercise. I don't do it in every workshop, but definitely in the 2 day workshops, that shows how tiny a combination of tiny requirements builds into a big complex thing really quickly. And this is one of the problems of software development. I just read an article today. I think Michael Feathers had tweeted out a link to an article, and they basically are showing there's these blocks that happen, like for more or less beginner programmers or early on programmers. After a couple thousand lines, things start getting too complicated. With somebody who's got a lot of skills, after 20,000 lines, for some, a team that's really great, maybe they're going to get blocked out at a couple 100,000 lines. We've got these levels where things just get out of control. And that's one of the things that I like about mob programming, is that it brings all the brilliant minds together. And so I try to show that in the workshop, how we're going to learn a lot about different ways of approaching things and come up with a hopefully good solution quickly by applying that. So the workshops are really just to get us familiar with what does it mean to work with each other. Why would we want to do this? And, these techniques of, I really like the techniques of working as a team like we've shared here, using a rotation. Many teams do it differently. The timed rotations that we use is something I like to get people used to as a starting point. So some of the other things, I wanted to share some of the things we might be learning in the workshop. One of the first questions I ever get when I do a presentation is people ask about, well, what's the right team size for mob programming? And so I share some of the ideas about who do we gather together and how do we go about determining that team size. It's not a matter of saying it's 7 plus or minus 2 people, and those are too easy. So some of the guidelines I try to share about successful collaboration. Now, I'm not an easy guy to work with, so I have to really be careful when I'm working with others, and I can share, some of the ways that I found that we can work better together. One really important thing is when we come to a very difficult time on the team, how do we get back on track? If we're getting on each other's nerves and things like that. So these are the things in the workshop that I like to share. But again, I'm basically just saying this is what you need to practice so that you'll get good at it over time. At the end of the workshop, you'll just know the things that you need to pay attention to, because you will not have been able to, like if you go to any kind of a work boot camp kind of a thing they talk about, you can learn the stuff that you're going to need to learn, but you're not going to learn how to become good at them. You're not going to become fluent with them. That's the way I would put it.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So a couple questions. So one of the things, I think we talked earlier, even before we started recording, about this Uncle Bob's Clean Coder videos. And I'm a big fan of them.
Oh, yeah.
And his test-driven development series he has is awesome. And one of the cool things he does is he answers all the objections. So what he does is he plays this other character who is the objector.
Right.
And he basically makes every argument against test-driven development and then answers them. So maybe we can do that now for mob programming.
Well, let's give it a try. So you got a list of those kinds of things?
Yeah. All right. So let's just start with this. How about managers who have a utilization mindset? Okay. And they may object to mob programming because they say, well, we're paying, 6 people, let's say, to work on software, and they're all working on the same thing. So it's inefficient and, they're not being utilized. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I actually think that that's one of the problems in software development, is that we think that separating people that should be working together is good. Mm-hmm. So how do we give an answer to somebody who's got that mindset? That's not something that we can't convince people of anything. I'm pretty firmly believe that. So,
sure.
If you've got somebody who's managing people, well, so let's try this one first.
Sure.
Gosh, there are people all over the world now doing mob programming. Are they getting this wrong?
Okay.
Look at this from a slightly backwards point of view. I've got a good friend of mine, Kevin Meadows, who helped me write the mob programming book. He kind of puts it this way with almost any idea. He'll say, well, if your competitors also found out about this, is it to your advantage to not learn how to use it? Or,
Right.
so yeah, your competitors might use it. Let's say they start using it. Is it to your advantage to let them fail at it? Or what if they succeed at it? So this is kind of the problem is we want to jump to the conclusion that something that doesn't seem quite right to us can't possibly work. What I found was that this is about optimizing for the flow of the work over the output of an individual. So I'd love to see somebody come up with some figures that proves working solo is better than working as a team. All I've heard is, well, we're getting stuff done in parallel. But there are so many blocks. We must have covered it last week. There are so many blocks to getting your work done. As a matter of fact, the biggest one is a product owner who cannot answer questions.
Yeah.
Like who says, oh, I'll get back to you on that. Or I'm in meetings all week. Can we meet on Thursday? That question queue time, that's going to kill us every time. The question queue time is the amount of time, or that's when we're waiting to get an answer to a question that's blocking us. So I don't try to convince people though that if you really got this utilization mindset, I'm ready for the people who are going, boy, this hasn't been working for us. What are we going to do?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so how about team members who might be reluctant because they say, oh, it's going to take too much time, and we don't have that much time to put. We have to get our work done, and this is a common, maybe an objection you may hear from team members
all the time, and this has to be a voluntary thing. I believe that. Pardon me. I believe that that a team that is made up of people who are starting to learn to work well together and see the benefits is going to do very well. Even if they don't mob program, I want to make that clear. Mob programming is about, it's the results or the path we went down for a team that was trying to learn how to work well together. We just happened to stumble upon mob programming and recognized a whole bunch of benefits. The way that I usually present this is that there's a lot of things that plague every team that's out there. Matter of fact, I do an exercise in my workshop where I ask people this is usually a 3-minute exercise. I ask people to form a small teams of 3 or 4 people and discuss with each other what are the things that block productivity. I kind of brought that up a moment ago. And when I do that, I did this at a place actually not far from where you're at right now, up in it was up in north of Boston. A 3-minute exercise with 20 people. They came up with over 50 unique things that block productivity. And I'll just share a couple of them here. One is fatigue. Another is hunger, personality conflicts, personality clashes, missing requirements, missing resources, insufficient resources. Here's 2, noise and too quiet. Those are kind of slightly opposed to each other. Context switching. One of the most common ones I hear is context switching. You're working on something. The boss comes in and says, hey, I know that thing's important you're doing, but we got this emergency. You start in on the emergency, and an hour and a half later, your boss comes in and says, I know that emergency is important, but we got this even more important emergency. And so, when we get back to the other work, it's going to be some ramp up time. There's 50 of these on this one list. I've gathered over 250 of them from these exercises. These are the things I want to talk to teams about. Sure, we're going to work slower in some ways, but it's not about how fast we're working. It's about how effective are we at getting the important things done. This is about flow. And I think that mob programming is one way to address flow. How do we go from beginning to end on something without waiting, without inventory, without wasted time, with as little work in process as possible? Pretty powerful
Yeah.
stuff.
I love it. Yeah, it's great. Okay.
So I
Awesome. All
can't
right.
really convince anybody of anything. When I do my presentations, what I'm trying to do is share some of the thinking I've had, but I could in
Mhm.
no way say, but you're going to get the same results with your team. I've
Right.
just seen it
Okay.
so many times now that there's a good chance, if you're willing to give this a shot, you might find that it's not slower. What we found was we got a lot more good stuff done, and not only that, it was better done. So fewer problems in it, and we were more likely to work on the right things instead of the things that later on we find nobody wants, simply
Yeah.
because we're turning around things so quickly. We can get feedback on each thing rather than waiting 2 weeks to deliver something. We literally were starting to deliver stuff several times a day, so you can get feedback so much quicker, and that's what allows you to steer to the better stuff. It's a real bonus, not just a mob programming, but working in a more Kanban fashion or modern agile kind of a approach.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for answering some of the objections you may hear, either from management or from team members. So that's great. So I wrote a blog post on our Agile Uprising blog. It was titled "Stopping the Enterprise Death Spiral with Mob Programming." And I
Yes.
don't know when I first when I first came up with this idea, I said, "Are people going to think I'm crazy by combining these two things?" But in my head, it made sense. So so I wrote it all out and I sent it to a friend. I said, "Can you look at this and tell me, am I nuts here?" And he really liked it. So and he gave me some feedback. So and I put up the blog post. So basically, the gist of the post, and I want to get your thoughts on this after I kind of go through it, is in 1963, there's a Dr. DeSola Price. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he has a law called Price's Law, and it refers to distribution of productivity, and particularly in domains of creativity. So his first initial studies were on PhD students in 1963, and how many of them had successful, let's say, PhD research papers or something like that. Okay. And that was the initial study he did. And then he started applying this, initially was kind of a theory, to other domains of creativity. And he kept seeing this pattern of distribution over and over and over again. And so the law he ended up coming up with is that if you take the square root of the number of people, okay, that are working on something, so let's say an organization, okay, that square root of that number will be responsible for 50% of all the value. Okay. So what that means is if you have 10 people in your company, approximately 3 people are going to represent 50% of your value producers. And if you look at, let's take music for example. So classical musicians, right? So out of all the composers who ever existed, about 5% make up 50% of all the classical music listened to. And what's interesting about that is even 5% of everything they created makes up about 50% of all the music listened to. Okay. So it has this crazy, and if you look at number of basketballs scored by basketball players, and it has this crazy distribution to where the more people you add, if you look at an X and Y graph, right? So on the x-axis, okay, you're going to have I'm sorry, on the y-axis, let's say you're looking at a company, right? You're going to have total number of employees, okay? And then on the x-axis, you're going to have productivity, okay? So if you look at that scale, if you think about 10 people in your company, 3 represent 50%. So scale it up to 100, right? So the square root of 100 is 10. So now 10 people are going to represent about 50% of your value. So those people are essentially your highest value producers. Those are like the exceptional people in an organization, let's say, right? So this is
Mhm.
what Price's law came up with. So Dr. Price came up with. So then I thought, well, imagine you scale to 10,000 people. Okay. Then it becomes really a small number of people who are considered your exceptional people. Now, what do we tend to do in organizations? Those people we tend to give very specific jobs to and say, if you want to, so team members have to go to that person to be able to figure something out, right? Or whatever. We actually tend to take the work away from them, if they're really, really high producer, right? So that's one part of it. Okay. So then I thought, well, you have this enterprise death spiral where a company goes through a bad quarter, they lay off some people, right? You don't know exactly who you're laying off if you're considering this distribution. That's one thing. And let's say that some of your people who are part of this small group of people, they might quit and they'll go to another company because a lot of companies want these people, obviously, So then you lose your best people, and then you have another bad quarter, and then it just goes in this spiral. And there's all this research done about Fortune 500 companies in the last 40 years, and I think it's something like only 12% it remain or something, some number like that. So then I thought, well, at a team level, if we know that there's going to be a very small amount of people that are represented in this distribution, right? That doesn't it make way more sense to try to raise everyone else's skill level up than just leaning on one of these people, right? Who we may or may not have in our team. Okay, to give you an example. Right. So isn't it like way more risk averse to do it that way? Because what you're doing is you're setting yourself up as a company. If you can focus on mob programming and growing your skill sets and building equality with multiple people at a time, then you don't have to so much worry about this law. That's what I mean. Because you're going to make sure that your skill levels are rising across a holistic view of the teams. So that's the gist of the article. You can read it on our blog. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. So okay. the first thing is what I've noticed over the years is, for example, you brought up the idea of the layoffs. So when a company is, let's say it's a downturn in the economy, and they need to cut back because they're just trying to keep their costs in line. They're going to go and get rid of the people that they think are the least valuable to them, or for some other reason they think there's some kind of a handicap for having them there. But what do they use to judge that? So the people who are these high performers that you're discussing, there would be no way to know at the time, for example, that Mozart or Beethoven or whoever we listen to now from those times, there's no way to know that they would have survived the test of time, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, people back then thought, hey, this is pretty good stuff, but is it going to, so we don't necessarily know. Well, who is it that we're going to keep when we need to cut back? I'm going to say a couple things that I think are pretty drastic. One thing is, it's most likely going to be the people that the ones that we'll keep are going to be the ones who have done the best job at making it seem like they're super valuable.
Okay.
They've learned to game the system.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to the basketball stuff for a moment. I remember, again, I never played it even on a league team or whatever in high school. It was just on the physical education class. But I remember the coach going, look, most of you guys are not going to be good at making the baskets. But when you're playing the game, you can get the ball to someone who's good at making baskets. So if you get the ball, look for that opening and get it to that person who's ready to take a shot. If you got the ball to them, that's where we can really see something happening here. So those high performers, they need a lot of other people around them that are helping them be high performers. Yeah, not in all cases, but there's one example of it. Now, the reverse in the so that's part of mob programming, is we keep the work flowing so that we're not, so to go from the start to finish on one piece gets rid of all the cost of coordination and communication that we normally have. And that coordination and communication is at a very much lower level than we get when we're all working together in the same context. So once we recognize that, if I'm contributing, let's say, 4 or 5 things during the entire day, but they were things that the team would have waited around for a half hour to an hour to get the answers if I wasn't there, then we can see we really benefit from having all that knowledge and skill sitting together. The work is going to flow through. So I would say that it's probably Well, so let's share another thing. The people who are actually good, like you were saying, that could pass on this knowledge, they now become better and better at helping others learn. So we
Right.
have this, what do they call that? Reinforcing cycle of goodness. That's not the right term, but somebody out there will be able to correct me. Where as we see the skills of the team grow and the abilities of the team grow, we become better and better at helping each other learn. That's a super powerful thing. There's a great article written by a couple guys. I don't know if I'll get their names right. Professors at MIT, Sturman and Repenning. We can get a link into the show notes. Did I mention this last session?
No.
They got a paper. I should look it up here, but it's. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. That's right there, and they have this great. The title of this is just wonderful. Nobody ever gets credit for fixing problems that never happened.
That's a good one.
And the byline to it, or the second line to it, is creating and sustaining process improvement. This is so very important. And the way that they present it in the paper, anybody can read it. You can find it online in the form of a PDF that I believe is available for free.
Okay.
The point of it is, ideally, we should be spending more time improving our capability than in doing the work that we need to be doing.
Wow. Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense to me. I would imagine there's people out there who might have a difficult time thinking about it that way, but I can't wait to read that article because I feel like one, I'll probably learn something from it for sure, but two, it's right down the line of the way I think too. So improve yourself, build the quality in together, right? And you don't have to fix the problems later. That's the idea.
Well, the beauty of this is that if you make, so you're essentially, so I don't think I can explain this very well, but I'm going to try to. We have the work that we're doing, and we either have an implicit or an explicit system of work by which we do that work.
Right.
And then, so we're starting to move outside of the system of work itself when we say, let's improve our capability. It's let's work on making it easier for us to do this work. Mark Graben, I don't know if I say his name right either. He writes on lean in the medical field, and he has a great quote. I must have shared it last time around, but it basically is that that it doesn't do us much good to say let's reduce costs and work on reducing costs. What's important is to make it easier for us to get our work done, and that will automatically reduce our costs.
Right.
Well, what a brilliant concept. And of course, it makes such good sense. That's right in hand with this article as well.
Right.
It's got to be, if we increase our capability a little bit each day and we see the benefit from doing it, it will become clear pretty quickly that spending more time on improving our capability pays back. This is one of the things we started doing as we were moving towards discovering mob programming. We were spending more and more time making it easier to do our work tomorrow, which is what TDD is about, and many of the things in extreme programming and within the world of lean and the world of agile.
Right.
Let's find ways to make it so that we can work at least at the same pace we're working today, tomorrow, and hopefully even move things a little faster or make it easier anyways. We get speed by making it easier as well. A lot of people focus on trying to make things faster when in reality, doing less work leapfrogs over all of that.
Right.
No,
it's great. So I got one more question, Woody, and I think we can wrap it up.
And I certainly will have 10 more answers. So,
my last question I have is, have you thought about this, or do you have any experience with this? How could mob programming take out of the development side of work and help with the business side of work?
Oh, gosh, it's all about the business side. Why are we writing software?
Well, I mean, okay, let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
So not mob programming per se, but mob something to do with the business, meaning not software development, but is there is an approach on that side of it we can think about?
Okay, so I heard a talk.
Yeah.
I take it back. I read the talk because I wasn't there to hear it, so I read the notes of it about mob marketing.
Okay.
And the way they explained it, I think this was a group from Vistaprint, and we could probably find a link to it somewhere. The group that does marketing, you basically get together some people with the skills of creating the artifacts themselves of the marketing materials, such as somebody who can do Photoshop and Illustrator. And you have a copywriter. And you have a marketing expert that knows the program we want to do. And somebody that understands the way we do our testing of the different aspects of a campaign or whatever. Whatever it is, whoever you need to do a marketing campaign, you bring them all together. And you work in the same way. And so I can make some ludicrous kind of examples. The ones that I do in my presentations are a good example, I think, is mission control of a space mission.
Okay.
We brought together all the people, all the brilliant minds. They're brought together to work on the same thing at the same time. And although they're not programming, this mission's critical. They don't want anyone there that isn't part of getting the work done, because that just introduces noise into the system. Mm-hmm. But we want to have everybody and enough redundancy. So in case, we need somebody on the spot, there's always someone with that skill set we need. And I don't know how many people they have in a space shot mission control, but it's dozens. There's lots of things to pay attention to. We need all that brain power on this single mission. Very different aspects of it. Another great example, I think, I don't know, most people in your audience will probably have heard of this, but when I was a kid, they had this group called the Beatles. And, I used to think about the Beatles as being, they were extremely polished, and they practiced a great deal. That has nothing to do with programming, but they basically had all the right elements. You wouldn't say, hey, yeah, I went to a concert to listen to Paul McCartney play the bass for 3 hours. We didn't do that. We had a band there to do that. And the same thing goes with so many other things. So we naturally collaborate in business, in our work all the time. Oh, I can give you a great example if you don't mind me. I told you I can give you 10 answers for any question.
Go ahead. It's fine.
I worked in a situation once where a sales vice president had seen some programmers pair programming, and he made a big to-do about it. And then a rule came in place that you can't pair program because we're just wasting money. These people, two people working on the same thing doesn't make sense. So I paid attention for a few weeks to how they were doing sales. And I'll ask you the question, how do you think they were doing sales?
They were at least pairing, I'm guessing.
Exactly. They would send 2 or 3 people out on a sales call. So I went and asked some of the guys, why are you doing that? It seems like, one person for a sales call should be enough. They said, well, first of all, while one person's explaining something, the other one can pay more attention to the signals from the person we're trying to talk to about this. And then they start seeing some gaps and they can share. And then when questions are getting asked, one or the other will have a better answer. And so we play off each other to come up with the right response. Then when it's time to bring it all back and put together a proposal, we now have 2 minds who have been listening to everything. And when we get back, we can put together a better proposal. While one person missed something, another person got it. And they had at least 10 or 15 things like that. And I thought, okay, then I was able to go and talk to that vice president and say, I'd kind of ask him, why are you doing this?
Right.
Why do you have 2 or 3 people going out on a sales call? I've seen this in many aspects of business now. So, mob programming I kind of think it's the reverse. Why weren't we working as teams all along with programming? I met with some people recently that do chemistry, having to do with adhesives, and they always work in teams of 2 or 3 or 4 as they're doing their research.
Right.
And that was intriguing to me because I was explaining to them what mob programming is, and they kind of said, yeah, that's how we work. I thought, okay. Yeah. Okay.
So,
Engineers do this,
so Uncle Bob
Yeah.
has this thing when he talks about TDD, and he has a great example, and I'm going to butcher it, but so basically he talks about if you look at our systems in the world. So let's take a bridge, right? There's not one nail in a bridge if you pulled out that the bridge is going to collapse, right? Or a house, right? So not one nail in your house if you pull out that bridge is going to collapse. Okay. But if you look at software development, you can have one mistake in the code, right? That could crash the whole entire system. Okay. So the fragility of software in nature, software development in nature, right? It's just inherently more fragile the way that software development works. So if you think about the importance of our software, especially now in business, that if you have an application that's crashing, if you have an application that's not performing well, there's so much competition in the world now that your customers are not going to stand for that, right? So why would you even think that you only need or should have one person looking at these things, right? The importance of what you're building, number one, right? And knowing how fragile software development really is, you can go in there and change one byte and the whole thing would crash, right? So that's I really like the way Uncle Bob, he was talking about TDD when he was talking about that, but I do think it applies to in this case as well to pairing and mobbing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say this, one of my early experiences with like the roots of mob programming was a bug fixing effort. And at times we would work with a tester, a developer, and a business analyst, the person who sort of really understood the business needs behind the software. The three of us would sit at the computer, and where I didn't then have to know anything about the business purpose of the code. Otherwise, if somebody had written a document that I needed to read to be able to try and fix this bug, I could never get enough knowledge that's stored in the context of the business expert's mind. Right. The other side is the tester. Now, the business expert usually knows how's this supposed to work? The tester often knows how does it actually work, right, and the steps you would need to go through to get it into such a state that you could expose the problem. They call that how to reproduce a bug, but it's really a lot about just how the state of this application can be. Testers have a complex job to do there. When there was the three of us, we could just nail these things. We would go through 2 or 3 bugs, maybe actually 3 or 4 per day, whereas previously it could take weeks. When the communication was made across time, so like somebody analyzes what the problem and where it might be, and then somebody gets assigned to work on it to do the coding. A week and a half later, that person's schedule it's put into their queue. Now they work on it. They look at it for a few hours and say, no, it's not in this area. So they write a report, and it goes back to the other people. And there's a waiting period. We did a value stream map of it, and we removed all that waiting. Mm-mm. You bring those 3 people together. This was like proto mob programming, right, and all of a sudden things get done really quickly. We need to observe that. That happens in so many different things. Yeah. I think it's a great thing to understand. This is about flow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Woody. I really appreciate your time. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this mob programming conference coming up?
It's a wonderful time. We're going to meet again this year in Boston, a little north of Boston. I guess it's Burlington. Okay. In Massachusetts, not far north, for 2 days. This is going to be the 12th and 13th of April. And we basically are gathering together people from as much as we can from all over the world who have been doing mob programming and have been learning about it, to just share our experiences in live hands-on mob programming. We will get together in coding sessions. We also have a leadership track, but I'll talk about that separately. In these coding sessions, we will pick something to work on, and the particular expertise of that person who's there, like Lisa Crispin, who'll be there, who's a testing expert, and others, whatever their specialty is, they'll share their insights as they facilitate the mob working on that particular thing. So there'll usually be 3 or 4 concurrent sessions going on, so you can choose where you'd like to put yourself. We've got some people who've been really digging deep into the ins and outs of making mob programming work well for them. And they've got a lot of good things to share. So it's not just one voice, it's many voices. And it's like the original Agile Manifesto concept of, we've been learning how to make things better by doing it and helping others do it. So let's gather this stuff together and share it with each other. So it's a great time. This will be our third year. The other 2 years, I loved it. It's very inexpensive, and it's well worth the time. So if you're interested in mob programming and you're just a beginner, we'll have some sessions for beginners. If you're already becoming kind of seasoned, there'll be plenty of people to bounce ideas off of and share your ideas with.
That's great. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, Woody. So I know at Woody Zuill on Twitter, that's Z-U, let me see if I can remember, Z-U-I-L-L, right?
That's right.
At Woody Zuill on Twitter. I'm at G4S Troy on Twitter. Anything else, Woody, that you want to promote?
No, thanks so much for bringing me here. I really enjoyed this talk, and these are the things that intrigue me every day, even though I'm deep in them. I love to have the conversation.
Awesome. And lastly, don't forget to check out our other podcast episodes, of course, on the Agile Uprising podcast, as well as our blog and our free coalition, which is a site where anybody can go and literally talk about any topics they want, ask questions, and we have a community of coaches and other people on the coalition who will everything's free and all the information's free, and it's all just collaboration and learning. So that's coalition.agileuprising.com. So just wanted to plug that because I'm on there a lot. So thank you, Woody. I really appreciate your time again.